They thought she was nothing more than a poor girl in a borrowed dress.
How terribly clumsy of me.
Who did this?
Hitting her collarbone like a wet slap, the cold claret pooled in her cheap lace before bleeding down her ribs. Someone laughed a high, nasal scrape against the ballroom's polite hum. Assuming she was nothing but a beggar in a borrowed gown, they had no idea who she actually belonged to. The heat in the grand ballroom of the Ashbourne estate was oppressive, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the breath of 300 aristocrats and the melting wax of 1,000 tallow candles. Cecilia stood near the periphery, wedged between a towering marble pillar and a potted fern that smelled faintly of damp earth and rot. She hated this dress. It was a pale, aggressive yellow, a color that hadn't been fashionable in a decade, salvaged from the attic and hurriedly let out at the seams by her mother's shaking hands. The stiff taffeta scratched violently at her waist. The corset beneath it, borrowed and slightly too large, dug a sharp ridge of whalebone into her lower ribs with every shallow breath she took. She felt like an imposter. Worse, she felt like a poorly disguised one. Across the room, the orchestra scraped their bows against catgut, churning out a waltz that sounded more like a march. The air tasted of roasted meats, expensive French face powder, and the sharp, metallic tang of spilled gin. Cecilia pressed her spine against the cold marble of the pillar. She just had to survive another hour. 60 minutes of staring at the patterned floorboards, of avoiding the sharp, predatory gazes of the women who knew exactly what a dying bloodline looked like. She didn't see Lady Agatha approaching until the sharp scent of heavy rosewater and sour wine announced her presence. Agatha was a woman composed entirely of sharp angles and malice, draped in deep emerald velvet that absorbed the candlelight. Beside her slouched Lord Thomas, a man whose wealth was only matched by the perpetual dampness of his upper lip. "Cecilia, darling," Agatha purred. Her voice was too loud, designed to carry over the swell of the violins. Several heads turned. The ambient chatter in their immediate vicinity began to thin out, replaced by the quiet, hungry silence of bored people sensing a spectacle. Cecilia stiffened. Her throat instantly went dry. "Lady Agatha, I was just telling Thomas here." Agatha took a step closer, swaying slightly. She was holding a crystal goblet filled to the brim with dark, bruised red claret. "I said, look at that brilliant shade of yellow. What? It takes true courage to wear something so historical." A few soft titters echoed from the onlookers. Thomas offered a wet, braying chuckle. Cecilia felt the heat rush to her cheeks. She didn't have a sharp, witty retort. Her mind, usually so practical and sharp when balancing the estate's ledger or bartering with the butcher, completely blanked. She just felt tired and embarrassed. She dropped her gaze to the floor. "Excuse me, I should find my aunt." She took a step forward, trying to slip past the pair. Agatha didn't move. Instead, she leaned in, her eyes glinting with a sudden, vicious boredom. "Leaving so soon? But you haven't had a drink." It wasn't an accident. Cecilia saw the deliberate flick of Agatha's wrist. The heavy crystal goblet tipped forward. A solid, dark sheet of wine cascaded through the air. It hit Cecilia's chest with a heavy, shocking cold. The liquid splashed against her exposed collarbone, stinging the skin, before soaking instantly into the pale yellow silk of her bodice. The taffeta darkened immediately, turning a bruised, horrific purple. The smell of fermented grapes and alcohol bloomed sharply in the space between them. The cold liquid seeped through the fabric, hitting the cotton of her chemise, then her bare skin, sliding down her stomach in freezing, sticky rivulets. For a second, the world stopped entirely. The waltz seemed to fade into a dull, underwater drone. "Oh dear," Agatha said. Her tone was flat, completely devoid of surprise. "How exceptionally clumsy of me." Thomas laughed loudly. It was a cruel barking sound that snapped the tension in the room, giving everyone else permission to join in. Laughter, rippled through the gathered crowd. Whispers flared up like dry brush catching fire. Look at her, ruined. It's not like she could afford a replacement. Cecilia didn't move. She didn't slap Agatha. She didn't scream. The raw, ugly truth was that she froze. Her hands hung uselessly at her sides. Her chest hitched in a tight, panicked breath, pulling the wet, sticky silk closer to her skin. She felt profoundly, deeply stupid. A hot, prickling shame crawled up the back of her neck. She looked down at the ruined bodice. The wine looked like a gaping chest wound. She raised a trembling hand, attempting to brush the liquid away, but the gesture only smeared the dark red stain further across the pale yellow, making it worse. She wanted the marble floor to crack open. She wanted to disappear into the damp earth of the fern beside her. She stood there, dripping, listening to the high, scraping sound of Agatha's triumphant giggles, entirely unaware that the temperature in the room was about to drop. The irony was, Cecilia hadn't even wanted to attend the Ashbourne ball. Just 3 days prior, the world had been quiet, smelling of rain and rotting leaves. She had been in the dilapidated glass house, attached to the rear of her family's crumbling manor, trying to coax life back into a row of withered hydrangeas. Her fingernails were caked in black dirt. Her hair was tied back with a frayed piece of twine. The glass roof above her was cracked in 3 places, letting in slow, rhythmic drops of cold autumn rain that pinged against the rusted iron shelving. That was where Nathaniel had found her. Nathaniel, the Duke of Westford. He hadn't arrived in a gilded carriage. He had ridden up the overgrown driveway on a massive, temperamental black gelding, wearing a heavy wool riding coat that smelled of damp horse and wood smoke. Cecilia had looked up from her trowel to find him standing in the doorway of the glass house. He was a large man, taking up too much space in the narrow, humid aisle. He didn't have the soft, powdered features of the men in her social circles. His jaw was square, rough with dark stubble, marred by a thin white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were the color of slate, flat, hard, and entirely unreadable. "Your Grace," she had said, not bothering to curtsy. She had wiped her dirty hands on her canvas apron, leaving dark streaks. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I'm afraid my father is in town, avoiding his creditors." Nathaniel stepped inside. The heavy thud of his mud-caked boots echoed against the damp stone floor. He didn't look at the dying plants. He didn't look at the cracked glass. He looked only at her. "I didn't come to see your father," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a voice meant for poetry. It was a voice meant for giving orders on a wind-battered dock. He walked toward her, stopping only when the toes of his boots were inches from the hem of her mud-splattered work skirt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. "Your father's debts," Nathaniel stated, holding the paper out. "The sum total, including the gambling markers held by the men in the East End." Cecilia felt her stomach hollow out. She stared at the paper as if it were a coiled snake. "I don't understand. Why do you have these?" "Because I bought them." She snapped her gaze up to his. "Why?" Nathaniel didn't blink. He reached up, his large, calloused hand moving toward her face. Cecilia flinched instinctively, but he only reached out to tuck a stray, damp curl behind her ear. His knuckles grazed her cheek. His skin was rough, warm. The smell of rain and leather wrapped around her. "I need a wife, Cecilia," he said, dropping his hand. He stepped back, rubbing his thumb absently over the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand. "The board of my shipping company prefers a settled man. The society matrons won't stop parading their simpering, terrified daughters in front of me. I have no patience for it." Cecilia's jaw tightened. "And you think I am what? A purchase?" "I think you are a pragmatist," Nathaniel replied, his tone entirely level. "I have watched you for 6 months. I watched you sell your mother's silver to fix the roof of your tenant farmers' cottages. I watched you turn Lord Ashbourne down at the summer gala Because he spoke down to your crippled brother. You don't weep. You don't swoon. You survive. He looked around the decaying glass house, then back to her. I have a vast amount of wealth, Cecilia, and a very empty, very quiet estate. You have a crumbling house, a mountain of debt, and a family to protect. It wasn't a declaration of love. It lacked the flowery, breathless promises written in the penny dreadfuls her maid read. It was a transaction. Cold, hard, and terrifyingly real. If I agree, she said, her voice shaking slightly, betraying her. She gripped the handle of her trowel until her knuckles turned white. What are the terms? What? Your family's debts are cleared. This estate is repaired. Your brother goes to a proper physician in London. Nathaniel paused. The rain drummed harder against the glass above them. In return, you stand by my side. You manage my household. You wear my name. And what of affection? The word tasted clumsy in her mouth. Nathaniel stepped close again. The sheer physical gravity of him was overwhelming. He looked down at her, and for the first time, the flat slate of his eyes shifted, revealing something darker, something fiercely possessive beneath the stoic surface. I do not share what is mine, he said softly, the words rumbling deep in his chest, and I protect what belongs to me. You will never have to worry about a roof leaking, or a creditor knocking, or a single person in this God-forsaken society looking down on you ever again. You will be the Duchess of Westford. He reached out and took her dirty, soil-stained hand in his large, clean one. He didn't care about the mud. He pressed a firm, warm kiss to the back of her knuckles. I will have the formal papers drawn up, he murmured against her skin. We announce it at the end of the month. That was 3 days ago. The papers were signed. The ink was dry. She was, by all legal and private definitions, entirely his. But Agatha didn't know that. Thomas didn't know that. As Cecilia stood in the ballroom, dripping with sour wine, the memory of Nathaniel's warm hand over hers felt a million miles away. The laughter was beginning to die down, transitioning into the low, buzzing hum of eager gossip. Cecilia kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards. A drop of red wine fell from the lace at her collarbone and splattered against the white marble near her toe. It looked exactly like a drop of fresh blood. Someone fetch a rag, Agatha commanded lightly, waving a dismissive hand toward a passing servant, or perhaps a mop. It seems the floor is taking the brunt of the tragedy. Cecilia forced herself to breathe. Don't cry, she told herself violently. If you cry, you give them everything. The corset was tight, restricting her lungs. The wet silk clung to her skin, chilling her to the bone. She felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. She just wanted to go home. She turned her body, preparing to make the long, humiliating walk across the floor to the exit. Then, the music stopped. It wasn't a graceful conclusion to the waltz. The cellist fumbled his bow, producing a harsh, screeching discord that cut through the chatter. One by one, the violins faltered and dropped away. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute. Cecilia stopped turning. She didn't look up, but she felt the atmospheric shift in the room. The oppressive heat seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp tension that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The low buzz of gossip died in the throats of the aristocrats. A heavy, measured footstep echoed across the marble floor. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of heavy, leather-soled boots. Not the delicate clicking of dancing shoes, but the purposeful, grounded tread of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside. They recoiled, shrinking back against the pillars and the walls, as if a predator had just entered the enclosure. Cecilia finally raised her head. Nathaniel was walking toward her. He was dressed in stark, immaculate black evening wear, devoid of any ostentatious medals or colorful sashes. The severe tailoring only emphasized the broad, brutal lines of his shoulders. His face was a mask of carved granite. His slate eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. They were locked onto Cecilia, tracking the dark, ruined stain spreading across her yellow bodice. He didn't look angry. Anger was loud. Anger was red-faced and screaming. Nathaniel looked like a winter storm right before it snaps the branches off the trees. The coldness radiating from him was terrifying. Lord Thomas, sensing the shift in power, took a nervous, shuffling step backward, his wet chuckle dying instantly. Agatha's smug smile froze, turning brittle and uncertain as the towering Duke of Westford approached their small circle. Nathaniel stopped. He was so close to Cecilia she could smell the faint, clean scent of bergamot and cold outdoor air clinging to his coat. He didn't look at Agatha. He didn't look at Thomas. He treated them as if they were entirely invisible, nothing more than dust motes floating in his peripheral vision. He looked only at Cecilia. He saw the slight tremble in her lower lip. He saw the way her shoulders curled inward in shame. He saw the red wine drying sticky and dark on her pale skin. A muscle in his jaw feathered. It was the only micro-expression of the violent rage boiling beneath his skin. Slowly, deliberately, Nathaniel reached up. He didn't pull out a handkerchief. He didn't offer her his coat. Instead, he pressed the pad of his bare thumb against her collarbone, right where the wine had pooled. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. In their rigid society, touching an unmarried woman's bare skin in public was a scandal of epic proportions. It was a ruinous gesture. It was an absolute claim of possession. Cecilia inhaled sharply at the contact. His thumb was warm, rough with calluses, sweeping gently across her collarbone, wiping the sticky red liquid away. "You are trembling," Nathaniel said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried perfectly. It was a low, intimate rumble, meant only for her, yet forced upon everyone watching. Cecilia's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, staring up into the flat, terrifying gray of his eyes. "I had an accident, Your Grace." Nathaniel's gaze flicked down to the ruined fabric of her bodice, then back up to her eyes. "This is not an accident. This is a mess." He finally turned his head, slowly, heavily. He shifted his gaze to Lady Agatha. Agatha visibly flinched. The crystal goblet in her hand shook, the remaining wine sloshing against the glass. "Your Grace," Agatha stammered, her voice stripped of all its prior purring confidence. It was a jostle in the crowd, a clumsy mistake. Nathaniel stared at her. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating, until Agatha's pale skin turned mottled red, and she looked away, unable to hold his stare. "A mistake," Nathaniel repeated. The word sounded dead in his mouth. He turned back to Cecilia. Without breaking eye contact with her, he reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had been covered in dirt 3 days ago. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm, warm, and entirely unyielding. He lifted her hand, turning it slightly so the candlelight caught the heavy, dark gold of his own signet ring on his right hand, making sure every single pair of eyes in the room saw how tightly he held her. "Come, Cecilia," Nathaniel said softly, though the command underneath it was absolute. "The air in here has gone foul. It is time I took my fiancée home." The walk to the double doors of the Ashbourne estate felt like wading through deep, freezing water. The crowd parted in absolute silence, pulling back their silk skirts and velvet coat-tails, as if touching Cecilia might infect them with whatever terrible, unseen wrath the Duke of Westford was radiating. No one whispered. No one coughed. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic strike of Nathaniel's boots against the marble and the wet, pathetic rustle of Cecilia's ruined taffeta skirt. He didn't slow his pace to accommodate her shock, but his grip on her hand was an anchor. pulling her through the physical space of her humiliation. His palm was calloused, burning hot against her icy, clammy skin. The moment they crossed the threshold out onto the grand stone portico, the crisp autumn air hit Cecilia like a physical blow. The night was sharp, smelling of crushed gravel and incoming frost. Deprived of the suffocating heat of the ballroom, the cold wine soaked into her chemise turned instantly to ice. A violent, uncontrollable shudder racked her spine. Her teeth clicked together, the sound loud in the quiet night. Nathaniel stopped. He released her hand, and for a terrifying second, Cecilia thought he was going to walk away, that the performance was over, and he was disgusted by the sticky, reeking mess she had become. Instead, he shrugged off his heavy black evening coat. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped into her space, blocking the wind with his broad frame, and draped the thick wool over her shoulders. The coat was massive on her. It carried his heat, trapped in the silk lining, along with the scent of bergamot, leather, and rain. He pulled the lapels tight across her chest, covering the dark, weeping stain of the claret, entirely obscuring the pale yellow silk. His knuckles brushed the underside of her chin as he gripped the fabric. He looked down at her. In the dim light of the carriage lanterns, the flat slate of his eyes was almost black. The muscle in his jaw was still ticking, a steady, rhythmic pulse of suppressed violence. "The carriage," he said, his voice rough, almost completely hollowed out. He didn't wait for the footman. He wrenched the heavy, lacquered door of his carriage, opened himself, and practically lifted her inside. The interior was pitch black and smelled intensely of oiled leather and horsehair. Cecilia sank into the plush velvet seat, pulling his coat tighter around her throat. The thick fabric scratched pleasantly against her freezing neck. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the heavy thud of the door closing, followed by the dip of the carriage as Nathaniel climbed in and took the seat opposite her. He didn't sit next to her. She was grateful for that. She didn't think she could bear the physical weight of his proximity without shattering entirely. The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching aggressively over the gravel drive. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The carriage rattled in the dark. The faint yellow glow of passing street lamps flickered through the drawn shades, throwing sharp, brief shadows across Nathaniel's face. He was staring out the window into the black night, his forearms resting on his knees. Without his coat, he was just a man in a stark white shirt and black trousers, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms corded with veins. Cecilia's adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a sick, hollow exhaustion. The corset was digging a bruise into her ribs. The wet silk clung to her stomach like a second, freezing skin. She felt profoundly stupid. "I didn't need you to do that," she said. Her voice was raspy, barely louder than the rattle of the carriage wheels. Nathaniel slowly turned his head. He didn't say anything. He just watched her. "I am used to them," she continued, staring down at her lap, her fingers twisting the wool of his coat. "Agatha has been cruel since we were children. It was just wine. It was a cheap trick. You didn't need to claim me. Not like that. Not in front of all of them. Before the papers were even filed. You would prefer I let her pour another glass over your head? I would prefer to fight my own battles." "You were standing there bleeding out, Cecilia," he said flatly. "You weren't fighting. You were letting them bury you." The blunt truth of it stung worse than the wine. A hot, ugly knot of defensive anger flared in her chest. "I was surviving. If I had slapped her, if I had yelled, I would have been the hysterical, bankrupt girl who couldn't take a joke. I had nothing to hit back with. They hold all the cards." "They hold nothing," Nathaniel snapped, his voice suddenly filling the small, dark space, vibrating against the glass windows. He leaned forward. The sudden movement ate up the distance between them. "They are bored, useless parasites, living on inherited credit. They have no power over you. They have the power to humiliate me. she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her. She leaned her head back against the velvet squabs, closing her eyes. A single treacherous tear leaked out of the corner of her eye, hot and humiliating. It tracked through the fine layer of face powder on her cheek. I hated that dress. I spent 3 days trying to fix the hem so it wouldn't look like it came out of a trunk. It didn't matter. They knew. They always know. She heard a heavy sigh, the rustle of fabric. The carriage swayed as Nathaniel moved. She opened her eyes to find him kneeling on the floorboard between her knees. There was barely enough room for him. He was too large, too solid for the cramped space. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He reached up, his rough fingers finding the wet, sticky collar of her dress beneath his heavy coat. "It is a terrible dress," he agreed softly, his voice devoid of mockery. "It was just a fact. The color makes you look like a corpse." A sharp, hysterical laugh punched its way out of her chest. She slapped a hand over her mouth, but the sound escaped anyway, raw and ugly. Nathaniel's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but the hard, granite lines of his face softened infinitesimally. He pulled a pristine white linen handkerchief from his trouser pocket and gently pressed it against her cheek, catching the single tear. He didn't wipe it. He blotted it, careful not to smear the dirt and powder. "You will never wear yellow again," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the dark stain on her chest. "And you will never stand silently while a lesser woman attempts to ruin you. You do not have to survive them anymore, Cecilia. You are a Westford now. You are the immovable object." He leaned back, bracing one hand on the velvet cushion beside her head. The heat of him was a physical pressure. "I told you I protect what is mine," he said, the low rumble returning to his chest. "I meant it. By tomorrow morning, Lady Agatha and Lord Thomas will understand exactly what it costs to spill a single drop of wine on my wife." Cecilia swallowed hard. The absolute, terrifying certainty in his eyes made her pulse jump. This wasn't a game. He wasn't playing the gallant hero. He was a man mapping out a war. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Nathaniel's thumb brushed the line of her jaw. The touch was achingly gentle, completely at odds with the cold, dead look in his eyes. "I am going to remind them," he said quietly, "that the ground they walk on belongs to me." The morning sun broke through the tall, unwashed windows of Cecilia's family manor, casting long, dusty beams of pale light across the faded Aubusson rug in the library. Cecilia stood by the cold fireplace, holding a porcelain cup of black tea that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. Quote, she was wearing a simple, high-collared dress of dark gray wool. The yellow silk monstrosity was currently burning in the kitchen hearth. She had watched the maid throw it in the fire at dawn, feeling a grim, satisfying closure as the cheap taffeta blackened and curled into ash. Her skin still felt tight, scrubbed raw with harsh lye soap, in an attempt to get the sour smell of claret out of her pores. Across the room, sitting behind her father's massive, cluttered oak desk, was the Duke of Westford. He hadn't left. When the carriage had arrived at her decaying manor the night before, he had walked her to the door, instructed her housekeeper to draw a hot bath, and then he had walked straight into the library. He had been there ever since. He looked exactly as he had the night before, minus the white cravat, which lay discarded on a leather armchair. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a dusting of dark hair. A dark shadow of stubble coated his jawline. He was surrounded by a mountain of ledgers, land deeds, and correspondence files that his own secretary had delivered by courier at first light. The scratch of his heavy fountain pen across heavy vellum was the only sound in the room. Cecilia took a sip of the bitter tea. "Are you planning to buy my father's house as well?" she asked, the dryness in her tone failing to mask her underlying anxiety. Nathaniel didn't look up. He signed his name with a violent, slashing motion at the bottom of a page. sprinkled sand over the wet ink, and set the paper aside. "No," he said, his gravelly voice thick with exhaustion. "I am simply assessing the collateral damage of Thomas's impending bankruptcy." Cecilia froze. The teacup clattered slightly against its saucer. "Bankruptcy?" Nathaniel finally looked up. His slate eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the red of a sleepless night, but they were razor-sharp. He leaned back in the creaking wooden chair, resting his large hands flat on the desk. "Lord Thomas," Nathaniel began, his tone purely conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, "derives the majority of his income from a fleet of merchant vessels that run textiles out of the West Indies. He doesn't own the ships, he leases them. From a holding company." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Cecilia stared at him, the pieces slowly clicking together. "A holding company you own?" "A holding company I acquired last year," Nathaniel corrected mildly. His lease agreements contained a standard morality clause. It allows the owner to terminate the contract immediately if the lessee's public conduct threatens the reputation of the fleet. Pouring alcohol on a Duchess in front of 300 peers of the realm constitutes a severe breach of public decency. Cecilia felt a cold rush of shock hit her stomach. "You pulled his ships." "I pulled his ships at midnight. They are currently sitting in the London docks, unable to unload their cargo. By tomorrow afternoon, the textiles will begin to rot from the damp. By Friday, his creditors will notice the lack of revenue. By next month, they will take his townhouse." Nathaniel picked up another piece of paper. It looked like a bank draft. "But that is just business," he continued, his voice devoid of any triumph. It was just arithmetic to him. "Lady Agatha is a slightly different matter. Her father, the Earl, is land-rich but cash-poor. He relies on a specific line of credit from the Royal Exchange to maintain their country estate and fund his daughter's extensive wardrobe." Cecilia didn't have to ask. She walked slowly toward the desk, setting her teacup down on a stack of dusty books. "And you control the Royal Exchange?" "I sit on the board of directors. I hold the majority share." Nathaniel tossed the paper onto the center of the desk. "I called the Earl's debts due in full at first light. He has 30 days to produce £40,000, or the bank seizes the estate." Cecilia stared down at the crisp white paper. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. The ink was barely dry. She felt dizzy. The sheer, terrifying scale of his retaliation was incomprehensible. She had expected him to cut them socially, to refuse to acknowledge them at gatherings, perhaps to have Thomas blackballed from his gentlemen's clubs. She hadn't expected him to casually, methodically dismantle their entire lives before breakfast. "Nathaniel," she breathed, the use of his Christian name slipping out before she could stop it. She gripped the edge of the desk. "You are ruining them, completely, over a spilled glass of wine." "No," he corrected, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He stood up slowly. The chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. "I am ruining them over you." He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, close enough to smell the stale coffee and faint trace of tobacco clinging to him. "You think this is disproportionate," he said, searching her face, cataloging the shock and the lingering traces of fear in her eyes. "It is terrifying," she answered honestly, refusing to look away. "It makes me wonder what you would do to an actual enemy." "They are actual enemies, Cecilia." He reached out, his knuckles grazing the high collar of her gray wool dress, resting over her collarbone where the wine had struck her the night before. "They looked at you and saw a wounded animal. They thought they could bleed you for sport. I am simply proving to them that the animal belongs to me, and it has teeth." Cecilia swallowed hard. Her pulse was a frantic, heavy rhythm in her throat. She looked at the exhaustion lining his face, the dark smudges under his eyes. He had stayed up all night, burning his own candle down to the wax, entirely consumed by the singular goal of avenging her humiliation. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was brutal. It was ruthless. And, God help her, she had never felt safer in her entire life. She didn't flinch away from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it slightly, letting the rough pad of his thumb rest against her pulse point. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter, steadier. Nathaniel dropped his hand. The terrifying intensity in his eyes fractured, softening into something that looked suspiciously like genuine, exhausted relief. He ran a hand through his dark, messy hair. "Now," he said, "I go home and sleep for 12 hours. And you," he looked around the dusty, crumbling library, a faint grimace touching his lips, "you pack a trunk. My carriage will return for you at noon. You are moving into the Westford townhouse." Cecilia stiffened instinctively. The papers aren't finalized. It isn't proper. Nathaniel let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. "Propriety burned to the ground at the Ashbourne estate last night. The entire city knows you are mine. If I leave you in this drafty ruin for another night, the society papers will call me a neglectful bastard." He stepped back, picking up his discarded cravat from the chair. He didn't bother tying it, simply shoving it into his pocket. He looked at her one last time, the cold Duke of Westford completely stripped away, leaving only a tired, dangerously protective man. "You survived, Cecilia," he said quietly, walking toward the door. "The war is over. Let me carry the armor for a while." He didn't wait for her to agree. He walked out of the library, the heavy thud of his boots echoing down the hallway, leaving Cecilia standing in the dusty sunlight, looking at the papers on the desk that held the ruined lives of her tormentors. She picked up her lukewarm tea. She took a slow sip. It tasted bitter and cold and entirely perfect. She turned and walked toward the stairs. She had a trunk to pack. What an incredible journey of survival and sweet, calculated revenge. Cecilia walked into that ballroom a victim, but she walked out a duchess, backed by a man who would tear down the world for her. If you love this deep, historical drama and the Duke's ruthless devotion, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce, protective romance. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic storytelling.